So our first panelist, we have Ta-Nehisi Coates. Coates was a former staff writer for The Village Voice and is currently a contributing editor and writer for The Atlantic. He has also contributed to various publications such as Time, O Magazine, and the New York Times Magazine. Michael Eric Dyson calls him a sharp-eyed, quick-witted observer whose haunting eloquence and lively intelligence introduce us to one of the most brilliant writers of his generation. With his critically acclaimed debut memoir, The Beautiful Struggle, which paints a touching portrait about growing up in West Baltimore, Coates is being hailed as one of the best young American writers of his period. Okay. Next we have Christopher Hayes. Go ahead. Next we have Christopher Hayes. Hayes is the Washington, D.C. editor of The Nation and a fellow at the nonpartisan Public Policy Institute New America Foundation. Hayes was a writing fellow for the Schumann Center and the Puffin Foundation. He is also currently a senior editor at In These Times, a liberal magazine based in Chicago. He has written on issues including union organizing, economic democracy, and the culture of technology. His work has appeared in publications such as the New York Times Magazine, The Nation, The American Prospect, The New Republic, The Washington Monthly, The Guardian, and The Chicago Reader.
Our next panelist is Amanda Terkel. She's the Deputy Research Director at the Center for American Progress and serves as the Managing Editor for the Progress Report and thinkprogress.org. Previously, she's worked in the office of Senator Charles E. Schumer, the office of the New York State Attorney General, and the 2004 presidential campaign of Senator Joseph Lieberman. She's appeared on many television and radio shows, including MSNBC, BBC, and Al Jazeera, and her writing has been featured in the New York Times, Politico, and The Guardian. And moderating the panel will be Corey Dade. He's the Atlanta correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. This past year, he did extensive coverage of the Democratic primaries in the presidential campaign when he traveled with the campaigns of both Senator McCain and now President-elect Barack Obama. He also serves as the president of the Atlanta chapter of the National Association of Black Journalists. He previously worked as a reporter at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Boston Globe, the Detroit Free Press, and the Miami Herald.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here, and this is a little bit of a different setup. As the moderator, I'm going to sit with the panelists. So if I'm not looking at you and looking at them, don't take it personally. As was said, I'm Corey Dade, and I'm with the Wall Street Journal. And obviously, we're here to talk about the new president and what that could potentially mean as far as coverage for journalism in general, but also for you as students who are trying to, break into our industry. So what we will do is begin with each panelist briefly explaining sort of what they did in the way of coverage, what aspects of the campaign they covered last year. And then we'll narrow from that, and we will reserve about 30 minutes for a Q&A. So you all, as you listen, take notes and be ready to ask your questions, and please don't be shy with it. As you all probably understand right now, as journalists, you're supposed to be pushy, so don't worry about it. I want to also explain that as we talk, what we're going to try to do is sort of twofold. On one hand, we're going to talk about maybe some broad concepts about politics or political coverage currently and going forward. But we also understand that you all are students, and we understand that you all aren't necessarily going to have lots of opportunities to talk about the latest executive order that Barack Obama rolled out. So what we will try to do at different points is combine what we would normally say about the industry and news media with what we may think could help you all as far as forming story ideas, as far as bringing the national news to your college campuses or to your summer internships or wherever you are trying to practice journalism. Often we have a problem as journalists, as professionals. We can talk about this stuff all day, but with students, they need to sort of know, A, how we got to where we are as professionals, that we didn't just come out of college and kind of jump onto the scene. So we will give you that. But B, also, you know, you all need to know kind of what our ideas are about how to come up with story ideas, how to enterprise, and you know, break out. Because I think with this new president, we do have opportunities, you all have opportunities as in this generation to do that in ways that many of us in college did not have. So with that, we'll get started. And what we're gonna do now, and we'll start here with Amanda, and we'll go this way. And Amanda, why don't you talk a little bit about who you are, obviously, but what you did during the campaign in the way of coverage.
Hello? Yeah. Okay. My name's Amanda Terkel, and I write for a political blog called thinkprogress.org. There are 7 of us who write on it, and we, during the campaign, I didn't really have a beat. Since we're bloggers, we sort of go around the internet, and whatever we want to write about and whatever we find that day, we write about, whatever sort of makes us angry when we're watching Fox News. And we did some reporting. We have a blogger who works with us named Matt Iglesias. He wasn't with us during the campaign. We have another site called the Wonk Room. The Wonk Room did a little bit more of looking at, okay, here's what the candidates are proposing on health care. You know, are these plans progressive enough? What else should we be doing? They did a little bit of that. We did a lot of watching the media. Is the media portraying Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton's policies unfairly? Are they, you know, having too many conservatives on TV? We would call them out on that. We monitor a lot of right-wing radio, crazy things like Michael Savage and Hugh Hewitt, most normal people don't listen to, but we would listen to them all day long. And when they had someone like Sarah Palin or Dick Cheney go on, they thought no one was listening, they would say something nuts, and we would highlight that. And it would trickle its way into the traditional media. And you know, we were always really excited whenever they were on radio. And we also did a lot of sort of, another role we played is calling out conservatives on their hypocrisy. John McCain would say he was in favor of something. We would look back and say, well, actually, you know, John McCain would say that the economy is not going well. Well, we would look back and say, oh, just 2 weeks ago, we found this quote by you saying that the economy is perfect, the fundamentals of our economy are strong. You were saying that President Bush has done a great job on the economy, and we would keep track of this and make sure that when the media is writing up their stories, we would try to pressure them and saying, well, you should also highlight what John McCain has been saying and give the full picture. Don't just rely on what the McCain campaign is putting out in its press releases. So we played a bit of a role of media watchdog, a little bit of reporting, some right-wing rebuttals, and also trying to advocate for more progressive policies. And it's fun working on a blog because we're not objective. We definitely lean to the left and try to push for progressive policies. So we can do a little bit of reporting and advocacy at the same time.
Hello? Yeah. So I write for The Nation magazine and covered the campaign this year. And one of the things, I've been a reporter more or less since I graduated college, but for the vast majority of that time I was a freelance reporter or writing for publications like a very small progressive magazine called In These Times based out of Chicago. How many people here have heard of In These Times? Yeah, okay. So, and if you want to cover politics, particularly at the national level, when you're essentially have no institutional affiliation and no juice, you're confronted with a problem, which is that you cannot call up you know, the governor's office, or you can't call up Senator Obama's office and say, hey, I'd like to sit down with Senator Obama and ask him some questions about X, Y, or Z. You don't have a lot of access. And so based sort of out of that kind of logistical challenge, I ended up just kind of covering politics in a way that didn't really involve ever talking to politicians. And there's actually a tremendous amount of interesting stuff that happens in politics that has nothing to do with politicians. And one of the great things about that, and I would stress this for the people in the audience, is that there are a lot of political stories that you can cover that don't require having any kind of institutional affiliation or juice or access. And because that was the kind of ethos that I sort of came to out of necessity, it's something that I've kind of continued. And the coverage that I tried to do in this campaign had as much to do with the people that were working on the campaign as ordinary citizens, as activists, as organizers, as much as it had to do with the actual candidates. So two examples of that. One is I went to Las Vegas during the Nevada caucus, which is the first ever caucus in that state, and covered the caucus. And I went to a few candidate events, but mostly I hung out with the organizers there. And then on caucus day, I went to this high school in East Las Vegas that was the site of one of these caucuses. And because caucuses are incredibly complicated Byzantine enterprises, and no one had ever done it before, it was a complete disaster. There were people engaged in tug of war over clipboards, and people barking out at each other, people standing on desks and yelling. In fact, the whole thing sort of seemed like it was edging towards a riot, and I actually called up the person that I knew inside the Democratic Party offices of Nevada and said, you really should send someone down here because things are really getting out of control. But the thing about that is it was a good story, and it was sort of interesting to watch the kind of, this is a point at which the kind of Clinton-Obama tensions, I think, were at some of their highest. And the point about that is that I didn't have to have any kind of, I mean, the caucus sites are open to the public because voters have to go there. I didn't have to apply for any credentials or anything. I just went to this high school, and I watched what I saw. The second story I did on the campaign, which I think is germane, was here in Atlanta. I wrote about basically Obama volunteers and organizers here in Atlanta. There was these groups that had kind of self-organized both in the city of Atlanta and in the suburbs along the GA 400 road north of the city. And I just hung out with them for a few days in July and looked at the way that they were registering voters. So went to farmers markets, I went to the Atlanta Car and Bike Show and the Georgia Dome and hung out for a day and watched people come by and register to vote. We went down to 5 Points and just sort of walked through the streets and kind of dodged 3-card Monte and guys selling the final call and all the kind of street life that was going on while people were trying to draw people in and register to vote, and wrote a story just about the way in which on the ground that this really remarkable, unprecedented grassroots organization was being built, and actually how it looked on the day-to-day level. It's really easy to talk in the abstract about, well, they're going to register so many voters and they're going to knock on so many doors, but actually doing that transaction is tremendously difficult and requires a lot of energy and passion and commitment. So those were some of the stories I did. I did other stories that were more sort of traditional campaign reporting, but those were the stories I did and that I liked the most and had the least amount to do with the actual politicians.
It's really weird having somebody asking you how you covered the campaign this year, because I had no plans of covering anything. Whatever coverage I did was primarily through blogging. And basically what happened was I was writing a book and the book ended and I really didn't have much else to do. But Barack Obama was running for president, and I thought it'd be very interesting to just give some impressions on what that was going to mean for the country. As I go back and I've done this recently, look back at, I'm struggling with this word coverage, forgive me, with the coverage that I did. I was less interested in, as a writer, I was less interested in who was going to win, who was up, who was down, as I was in the cultural significance of Barack Obama for African Americans. So there's one way of covering Barack Obama and black folks, and that is, where will Barack Obama take black people? Will Barack Obama finally civilize black people? That's that sort of coverage. The other way of covering, and that's, I shouldn't demean that in that way, because that's an important angle. But the other way of coverage is, what does Barack Obama say about where black people are? What does he say about the moment? What does he say about, you know, what folks have been expecting, waiting for, and thinking in the community? So most of my writing, at least the stuff that I find most interesting now, was about that. You know, it was about walking up and down the streets in Harlem where I live, and, you know, listening to the conversations, getting impressions about what people were saying. It was about, when I finally did do some print coverage, going out and, you know, interviewing Michelle Obama. But as important as it was to go out and interview Michelle Obama, what was more important was listening to, you know, what my sister and what my aunt said when they found out that I was going to interview Michelle Obama, and what they said about, and what that said about how black women feel about her. That was much more important to me. Also, just sort of the impressions and the sort of absurd gap between how African Americans see themselves and how the rest of the world, or I guess the media world, sees African Americans. And I think Barack Obama exposed that. So for instance, when there was this whole rift between Barack Obama and Jesse Jackson, and there was this big angle on Barack Obama and black leadership, and who will speak for black America. You know, I had a poll on my blog to elect somebody new to speak for black America. And it was just sort of to expose the absurd idea that any one person speaks for any one group of people. I had a lot of fun. It was tremendously entertaining. I guess as a writer, I always feared that I would never live in a time where something big would happen, and I would have the opportunity to observe it, to speculate on what it meant. And this was just a great year for that.
Thank you all. Thank you, panelists. I realize I didn't tell you what I did in coverage. I started out at the beginning of the year covering the Democratic primaries and a few of the Republican primaries, but mainly as they swung through the South. One of the stories we did in January, it was right before the South Carolina primary. We went into the South Carolina and we looked at the ground operation for the Clinton campaign and for the Obama campaign. And we spent a week there, and we basically were able to put together a fairly long narrative about how those two operations differed. And, you know, as far as we can tell, it was the first story to actually go in depth about the philosophy of Obama's campaign on the ground, as far as how he brought in not just volunteers, but the philosophy behind it, and the fact that overall it was geared toward circumventing traditional retail politics and endorsement politics, which is to say, you go to a prominent minister, you go to a prominent state legislator, you go to a prominent city official, and you get their endorsement, and you basically put the responsibility on that person, that official, to deliver you votes or money. In this case, the Obama campaign realized that in South Carolina, they didn't have that kind of connection, that the Clintons had already sewed up every Democrat in the South, black or white, so they wouldn't have that opportunity. So we were able to show that they actually literally went around them, going to barbershops, going to high school football games, going to community associations and neighborhood groups, and literally starting there and getting volunteers to actually use their relationships in the community to be their leaders. So the field organizers, in many respects, were people who had no experience in politics, but who had lots of experience in building relationships on the ground. And so that obviously became a huge theme for the rest of the campaign. After that, when the general election came, I got on the trail, which is to say I covered McCain and Obama, but mostly Obama, on their buses, on their planes, wherever they went through the general election. And I would rotate on to the trail with for a week or so, and then rotate off. And when I was off, I would do kind of spot stories. By spot, I don't mean spot news, but I mean covering issues, going to different states or diving into certain issues that look to be important. Just pulling something out of the air, a story about, and this was fairly early in, either August or early September, that, the fact that with Obama's strategy to register voters as one of his big strategies, that the Republicans were preparing to gear up to find sort of new ways and inventive ways to challenge voter registrations from state to state, and the fact that perhaps for once that this would be perhaps an even fight, where Democrats actually, the Obama campaign had lawyers stationed all over the country basically waiting for these challenges and trying to head them off before they happen. So that kind of setup. Now, beyond that, we're going to go, I'm going to ask everyone, and this is a quick answer because this is a jumping off point. What I'm going to ask you all is to kind of wipe the slate clean for what you did throughout the campaign year and think about where you were on November 5th and what you were thinking when the results came down, or late November 4th. Think about what immediate takeaways, if you had to take a snapshot and a quick one, just one line, what would the takeaway be about sort of not just the election, but what this means in general? And I'll follow up in a second.
Well, on election night, I was actually on air for Voice of America, and the results came in, found out Barack Obama won, and I was supposed to be very calm. So, but you know, inside I was really excited. And you know, the first thing I just thought was, you know, what are we going to do now? I've never done journalism. My political awareness basically began with the Bush administration, and our target had always been President Bush. So what were we going to do now? We had a new progressive Congress, we had a new progressive president. You know, this completely changed how we were going to do journalism. And, you know, in many ways it was exciting because it presented all these, you know, we could throw out the old models of doing journalism. And not completely, but, you know, Obama promised to make government more open, more transparent. You know, we had the opportunity to get new sources, new progressive voices. So it was just sort of, you know, we were basically able to wipe the slate clean and go forward.
I was in Richmond, Virginia. My brother was the deputy field director for the state of Virginia for the Obama campaign, and I'd gone down there to do some reporting and also hang out with him and wanted to be with him. He'd spent, you know, 17 months of his life working on the campaign. So, you know, I felt ecstatic, and I felt really proud of him in a kind of selfish and familial way. And I just felt a profound sense of redemption. You know, someone that I know said that he felt like election night was the anti-9/11, insofar as it engendered this kind of communal solidarity, which is something that we don't really experience much in American life, and the only other experience we've had of it is in the wake of horror and devastation and death. And this was a feeling of communal solidarity that was based in something hopeful and redemptive. And I kind of wish that moment could have sort of stretched out for a long time, because I also, at the same time I was feeling that, was realizing that there was a lot of, the country was mired in a pretty bad place, and there was going to be a lot of fights ahead.
I'm going to step in before Ta-Nehisi answers. What I'm hoping to do also, while that's important to tell us what you feel, I want to know, as people who wrote about and observed and analyzed the campaign, what your sort of analytical takeaways were from that moment. Kind of what you saw as the biggest top-line observation you had.
I was with my family and the family of my editor. I was tremendously relieved, more than anything. It's, you know, this is a huge question about, you know, what does it mean? And I'm going to give you the best answer I have, which is that I don't know. I've been slowly, you know, since the election, coming to some awareness about what it possibly means. I think for what it means for me, and I've said this before, as an African American, it redeemed the idea that you should have faith in humanity. I think a lot of African Americans were very skeptical, not so much about Barack Obama personally, but that he could go to states like Iowa and win. That in a general election he could go to states like Virginia and North Carolina and win, or even be competitive, that he could even try to be competitive in a state like Georgia. And I think the thinking behind that was essentially that white folks won't do it. Won't do it. And we've been mired in that sort of cynicism for so long. And I think if there's any connection between Barack Obama and Martin Luther King, it's that. And Martin Luther King always had great faith in the humanity of people who, you know, if you just cut on the TV, you would have thought hated you. And he always brought that forth to black people and said that really is the way forward. And I think Barack Obama's election was just a reminder of that. Now, I know that there were certain conditions. You know, my dad joked with me, this is going to be a little off color, but he said to me after Barack Obama won in Iowa, and I was all ecstatic and happy, he said, son, white folks only hand something over to black people when it's completely broken. So there's that. There is that aspect of it. I mean, the country is broken. Having said that, nevertheless, there are people who would have driven over the cliff nevertheless and would have died, you know, before they saw a black president. And to see that, you know, all jokes aside, that we are not as bad off as we thought we were. And we're bad off in some other areas, but that we have indeed made some progress, that this is not 1968, it's not 1978, it's not 1988, it's not even 1998. We've come forward, and so I think that has to be said.
Yeah, and in terms of sort of the analytic takeaway, I think that, I mean, to be totally honest, in that moment, I don't think my analytic faculties were particularly strong. I think they were essentially drowned out by the way that I felt emotionally and viscerally. But I think the next morning I woke up and I drove back to DC, and the thing that I was thinking then is just about the election was the first test of the degree to which American democracy is functioning, insofar as a mechanism by which problems are addressed, policies are crafted, and competing interests are mitigated, competing interests are mediated, and outcomes are sort of formed, governing outcomes are formed because of that mediation. And that the election was sort of kind of passing a sort of threshold mark for how functioning the American democratic enterprise is, but that the next test is going to be, can the will of the American public, which is to do things like end the war in Iraq, to provide health care for every person, that's the next test, is whether that same transmission belt by which people's, you know, volitional desires for what a kind of better society and better government look like actually get transmitted into policy. And that to me is the remaining open question, and the one that I think is pretty tough.
One other thing that I was thinking that night was it's finally been shown that this is no longer a center-right country. And a lot of commentators were still trying to insist that in the days after, some conservatives, but also still some mainstream media. They were saying, well, Obama may have won, but he was an anomaly. This is still a center-right country. Because if you look at polls, you know, slightly more people still identify themselves as conservatives or independents. But, I mean, the notion of what it is to be a progressive or to be a conservative has shifted more to the left. Liberals now, I think, are more liberal than they were, you know, a couple decades ago. And so I don't think Obama's election was an anomaly. I think that we are seeing the public is finally starting to realize that a lot of these so-called center-right policies aren't working anymore. And you know, the conservatives aren't giving that up. They're still saying, you know, what the public wants is tax cuts and the stimulus. That's all they want, no spending. And, you know, polls are still showing that the public actually doesn't want tax cuts. That's what they rejected in the election. But that was one thing that the election reaffirmed for me.
Thanks, panel. I did that exercise to give you all an idea of sort of how journalists do what we call kind of framing ideas. And one of the things we can look at is the campaign itself, or excuse me, election day itself being a marker. Obviously it's a historic marker, but since the topic is, you know, how or what is there to cover in the era of an Obama presidency, you have to start with a marker. And the marker is, as these three just pointed out, what were their observations coming away from the election? And so we have, you know, that one journalist can shift her focus away from anti-GOP reporting, or instead of looking at sort of opposition research all the time and writing off of that, she can try something different. Another one, redemption, communal solidarity, looking at, restoring faith in humanity, looking at the election as, finally, there is a test that's been passed that shows elections are sort of a method by which Americans redress the ills of society. And of course, the issue of whether or not America is actually disprove the notion that they're center-right. Maybe they're more left of center. So my point is, if that is your foundation, if you frame it that way, perhaps those are the themes that you go forward from and actually cover from. So, if in fact, Amanda, now has a new opportunity, perhaps the coverage for her is to actually shift, or people covering Amanda, for example, because media cover media. So, does Campus Progress or the Center for American Progress, their publications, do they shift? Do they actually do what they thought they could do? In that, instead of looking at sort of the competition, looking at the ruling party, so to speak, they actually go in a different direction. And perhaps look at whether or not the president is delivering on his promise of an open government. Another coverage strand, as this presidency moves on, what happens to that feeling of communal solidarity? Look for stories that demonstrate that. Volunteerism is one of the things he talked about, service, Obama that is. Does volunteerism rise? Does civic engagement increase? Does campaign volunteerism on a local level increase? Faith in humanity, well, that's an ethereal concept, and there's so many different ways to test that as a reporter. So you can, or as a writer, faith in humanity may, again, manifest in the form of volunteerism. But, the election passing the test about righting wrongs, well, now we look at whether or not this Democratic leadership does that. And we look at, coverage-wise, what crops up from community to community or in Washington that would suggest that America continues to be maybe left of center. So those become, in some ways, your benchmarks. And we often get into a point as journalists and young people as being reactive, which is fine. We have to react to the news of the day. But one of the things Ta-Nehisi talked about is paying attention to the people around him, which is to say, I always say students need to be students of life. As students, we're so trained to open a book and be fairly institutionalized in how we learn, but as journalists, we have to be observers of what's around us. And often what's around us is actually a reflection of what's happening elsewhere. So if you see it here, chances are you can find other examples of where something the same way is happening elsewhere. There's your story. So now I'd like to move from there and ask you all, now we've had 3 months and some change to digest the result of the election. Have your opinions or have your observations changed, been reinforced, or shifted as you kind of look for new ideas to write about? Where are you all with your kind of, realizations or changing attitudes since November?
One of the things that is the central theme, I think, of the coverage I'm doing now, I'm writing a column every week for the magazine, is the structural, cultural, political, economic, and institutional barriers to change. That, obviously the campaign was about change in both in terms of how the message was crafted, but I think it's just a basic kind of majority referendum on the rule of the governing party. It was about change. But go all the way back to the crafting of the Constitution and the Federalist Papers. In many ways, the American democratic project is set up to kind of always be riding around the car with the parking brake on, and there are a million different ways in which that's woven into just the structure of American governance. And then atop that have been layered a bunch of other things that keep the parking brake on, and that's the influence of entrenched interests and lobbyists and campaign finance, the culture of Washington, the kind of corrupt, inbred nature of the Washington establishment. Now, all these things pile atop each other to keep things from changing. And to me, the most interesting story right now in Washington, and the thing that I'm sort of most focused on, is the degree to which these two trends are in conflict. The election is an election about change, and the institutional barriers to making that change happen. And we're seeing it right now in the stimulus debate as a perfect example. Why does it take 60 votes to pass something in the United States Senate? No, there's no real answer to this, actually. I mean, it's not in the Constitution, right? In fact, the filibuster threshold used to be even higher to clear a filibuster. It used to be 67 votes. It was changed in the 1970s. So, you know, the filibuster was just one small little sort of institutional wrinkle that has these profound consequences for whether the country changes or not, but there's a million of those.
One thing I think has been interesting is to see how the media hasn't quite been able to adjust to having progressives in power. My site, Think Progress, we recently did a study. The media used to say, we have more conservatives on television. It's because Republicans are in power. Okay, well, when progressives take power, theoretically, there should be more progressives on television. We did a study, and we looked at, since the stimulus debate has been going on, there have still been far more conservatives on television, and the rationale is, oh, well, we want to hear the opposing side. So why are they still not having progressives on television? Their progressive voices are still being drowned out. And so, you know, we've been trying to call that out and get that to change, because that was one thing we were hoping that the election would change, is that more progressive voices would come out. We see the media still turning to Bill Kristol to tell us what's going on in the Obama administration. How does Bill Kristol know what's going on in the Obama administration? So, you know, which is why I think it's such an exciting time for young journalists, is right now, many people in the media who are used to covering the Bush administration are still turning to their same sources who are wrong about Iraq and were, you know, defending the Bush administration for all these years. It's a great time for young journalists now to develop sources, figure out who will talk to you in the Obama administration, who knows what's going on. You can cultivate them. And so, you know, when you move on to bigger papers, when you graduate from college, you now have all these sources that are different than the ones that people have been relying on for years.
There's been a lot of reporting about how Barack Obama was going to come in and shake everything up. Obviously, the mantra was change, as Chris talked about, and how he's, you know, basically been proven, for lack of a better term, to be status quo. I have not been particularly amazed by any of that. I think, like, when I think about supporting Barack Obama, I think about the past 8 years and the complete just. I guess I think about more than that. I think about the past 30 or 40 years. And I think about not so much about how the country tilted conservative, but how a particular brand of anti-intellectual, Southern strategy, anti-science kind of thinking took hold of the country and basically reached its apex in the last 8 years. What I wanted more than anything was the end of that. And that was more important to me than a black guy being in office. It was more important to me than anything. I'm so happy, and maybe a little too happy, that they're actually thinking people in the office now. You know, just a little nuance in how things are talked about. Barack Obama went on TV the other day to talk about, God, what's his name? Daschle, and how Daschle had to pull out. And he said that he screwed up. And like a lot of people probably sitting on this panel, I was completely amazed. And then I was amazed at the fact that I was amazed. Because if you think about it, that's what you're supposed to do, as Chris Rock was saying. I mean, that's what you should do when you screw up. You're supposed to, you know, you're supposed to say, I screwed up. You know, you're not supposed to get credit for, you know, saying that. But yet and still, I was just amazed given the past 8 years. I think in terms of my writing, what I'm much more focused on is how, as African Americans, we're experiencing this moment. And I've done, I guess, quite a lot of blogging in the past 2 months about how, particularly African American intellectuals who have, I guess, made their careers over the past 20 years digging into their respective spaces, Cornel West on one side, Shelby Steele on the other side, how having a black person as the most powerful person in the world, how having the top cop in the country being African American, how that adjusts your thinking, and how we cope with that, and how that questions some of the old sort of ideologies that we all went by. So that's where I've been.
Thanks, panel. I think as you all listen, the idea here is for you all to start getting into the heads of our heads and saying, okay, there's a story here, there's a story there. Ta-Nehisi just laid one out. The black president, you know, one of the ideas, one of the things that everyone knew was going to happen, certainly in media, but in the world, is that if a black president wins, the question is going to pop up. Do we still need affirmative action? The question will pop up now with a black attorney general. How does he, or does he at all, address sentencing disparities with whether we're talking about crack versus powder cocaine, which obviously has just shifted, or whether we're talking about the distribution of police according to certain neighborhoods, or whether we're talking about the disparity in convictions achieved in minority and poor communities versus non-minority and poor communities. These are the types of issues that are questions that may begin in your head, but probably begin in discussions. Those are story ideas. And so as it stands, you start going out and looking for those ideas. Chris talked about sort of the push-pull in Washington between the change agents and the people who are invested in the status quo. And often those people are not elected officials. So that's a thick vein there to tap. And so the idea is to kind of regionalize or localize these things that we're talking about. You all live in certain communities. You all have all these different things playing out. You may think the push-pull between the status quo and the change agents isn't happening in your college, for example, or at your hometown city hall, but they are. For example, I'm going to throw this out there. Your local governments or your state governments are going to get stimulus funding. Well, there are going to be all types of different interests that crop up. And the governors and the mayors and the local leaders are going to have to decide where to put that money. Well, a quick and easy story to do is to look at who's invested in putting the money in the areas where the Obama administration envisioned, and which leaders are invested in taking that money and perhaps shifting that use into something else. And so that becomes a story idea you look at. Most of you all are in college. Some form of stimulus funding is going to come to colleges in some way. It may be just budgetary funding that comes through the state to your state universities. It may be in the form of some nonprofits that get money through some programs that they do on college campuses. You can start looking at where that money goes and whether it actually benefits its source. The other thing I'll put out there, and we'll go to another set of questions, is one of the things that was powerful in this election was the engagement of young people. There are all types of young people all over the nation that dropped out of college to go work on this campaign and said, I'll go back to college after this because this is so incredible. Those are ready-made stories. Let me, by a show of hands, let me ask you, how many of you all know people in your class, people you grew up with, your peers, who worked on the Obama campaign, and they may not have dropped out of school or anything, but worked on it? Look at that. We don't need to be here, you all do. You all need to be up here. For the first time in generations, you all, as student journalists, in some ways may be closer to the story about what this presidency will mean in the way of news coverage, because you all have relationships with the people who help make the news. We usually have that. Like Chris talked about, Chris was able to be enterprising and find ways to write about policy and politics without actually having the juice, as he put it, to get them to sit down with him. You all have the juice to get these people to sit down with you. Check in with them. Find out if they've come back to school. Find out if this has created a new set of opportunities for them when they've gone on to volunteerism elsewhere. Find out if they've, in some cases, maybe gotten hired into the Obama administration or some aspect of federal government. Find out how their lives have changed tangibly, and those are stories. Now, I'd like to shift and ask, this is a break from sort of story ideas, I'd like everyone to talk about how they got to where they are, what school they went to, and sort of what generally was their route to where they are. Because these students need to know that, you know, invariably, you don't get your sheepskin and walk into where you are where we are right now. It takes sometimes circuitous routes to get here. So let's start on the opposite side. Ta-Nehisi.
I've been getting this question a lot in front of students, and I hate answering it for reasons that are about to be clear. I was in high school and middle school, high school, and into college, a pretty awful student. I almost failed 11th grade. I went into 12th grade with about a 1.8 GPA. Was threatened by my dad, who told me that no matter what happened, I was getting out of his house when I turned 18. And I would either go into the Army or something. I knew I was not cut out for the Army. That was clear. So I worked my butt off, got my GPA up to a reasonable level, did pretty good on my SATs, and went to Howard University. I know that's dangerous to say down here at Morehouse, but did go to Howard. Continued to be a pretty bad student there. Didn't get much better. Loved Howard, loved being there, loved the campus life, you know, loved living it up, had a ball, but was never a particularly good student. But I did start working on the student newspaper. And I did come to college with a skill, and that is that I had been writing since the time I was about, oh my God, 5, 6 years old. When I used to get into trouble, my mother, she would make me write essays. Well, not essays, 5 or 6 sentences about what I had done, why I had done it, and what I thought about it. It was the best practice in the world. It really, really was. We didn't do the whole, you know, right, I will never do this again 500 times. I mean, you had to like construct an argument about what you did and, you know, what you plan to do in the future. I had been raised writing. I had been raised reading. And even though I wasn't a good student, I loved learning. So, like, you weren't going to tell me when I was going to read something. I was going to read it when I wanted to read it. But I was going to read it. You know what I mean? I was going to read it. I really was. I was going to get around to it. So I get to Howard. I started on the student newspaper. Wrote and did reasonably well there. I got an internship at the local alternative paper in D.C. Did that for a little while, and then actually got a very low-paying job there. Low-paying in retrospect, but the very idea that someone would pay you to write was amazing to me. I mean, it was like someone, for me at that time, you know, I kid you not, it was like someone saying, I will pay you to eat. I mean, it was that, I mean, I couldn't believe people got paid. I thought you paid other people to write. So when they told me that I would be paid to write, the relationship between me and school, as bad as it had begun, it became much more distant, and culminated with me actually dropping out. It drove my parents crazy. They thought I had lost my mind. I was about 22, 23, something like that. I had been flopping around in and out of school. Long story short, I left. No degree. Scared the hell out of my parents. But I knew what I wanted to do. And I really think nothing else matters besides that. I had no other skills. You know, I was either going to do that or I was going to drive a cab. It was really that simple. It was not there was really no in between. I wasn't going to go to law school. I wasn't going to go get an MBA. I wasn't going to go be a dentist. I wasn't going to go be a doctor. I was going to be a writer, or I was going to be nothing. And I was very clear on that. This is not something, from my perspective, and other folks may tell you different. From my perspective, no one should ever go into journalism or writing of any real form for money. It's simply, it probably pays worse now than it paid then. I think there were career tracks then. There probably are less career tracks now than there were then. You do it because you can't not do it. And that really, ultimately, I feel is the only good reason. I mean, I worked at Time magazine for 2 years, and I would meet people that went to Ivy League schools, had great educations, and clearly were doing journalism because they were okay at it. They had marginal skills. They could get by doing it, and they didn't know what else to do. And at that time, it paid decent and a decent amount of money, and it had decent benefits. All those jobs are gone now, by the way, but they were there at the time. But even still, I always thought, if you're going to sell out, don't sell out to journalism. I mean, be a real sellout. Go to Wall Street and really don't sell out to journalism. It's not enough. It doesn't give you enough to sell out. I mean, I think you almost have to have the approach that an actor has. I mean, it's that sort of thing. It's not, a career track. It's something you do because you can't really do anything else. Now, that's my unique perspective. Other people may have another perspective. I'm not saying it's wrong, but that was really how I account for it. And I think for any success I've ever had in the field, it's because of that. It's because I felt that I had no other choice.
Okay, I'm going to ask us to be a little bit quicker with our answers so we can get to Q&A. That's all right. That's all right. They need to hear it.
I grew up in the Bronx. I went to a public high school in New York called Hunter High School. I went to Brown University. I didn't do much journalism at all there. I mostly did theater. I was a philosophy major. I started writing for the weekly alternative paper my last year. I always thought I was going to be an academic. I always thought I was going to be a philosopher from the time I was a little kid, which is weird. Now that I think about it, but was really kind of over school by the end of it, and over academia particularly, and thought, well, there's this hustle maybe that I could run in which I can get people to pay me to learn and write, and one way to do that is academia, but if I could work out that hustle in journalism, that would be all the better. And so I just started freelancing. I moved to Chicago with my partner. We lived there. I started freelancing. I started writing for the local weekly alternative paper. I got clips sent around. I pitched. I wrote a brochure about senior elder abuse. I worked in an Italian restaurant. I taught English at a community college. I made $8,000 my first year out of college. And I just hustled and pitched and freelanced, and then I got picked up by this small magazine called In These Times, and from there, then to The Nation. So that's it.
I grew up in Buffalo, New York, and then went to college at a place called Colgate University, which is in upstate New York. And I had always thought I had always wanted to go into politics ever since the first time I came to Washington, D.C., and I had done a lot of traditional campaign, working for my senator, but I didn't necessarily like some of the work I was having to do. I knew out of college I was probably going to be just answering phones and basically be a receptionist. And I decided to go to the Center for American Progress because at the time it was sort of a young think tank. It was really exciting, and I liked the fact that they put a lot of emphasis on communications, aggressively getting the progressive message out there, rebutting what conservatives were doing. So I came to the center, interned initially for no money right after college, which was tough living in Washington, D.C., and did some national security policy, did some fundraising, realized neither of them were quite for me, and ended up getting hired over on the blog, which has been great. And from the blogs and new media now are a really great way for young people to get involved in journalism. It's really, it's tough because a lot of places, if you don't get to work at an institution, you won't get paid. You have to rely on ads, you have to rely on your readers donating to you, but increasingly it's a good way to get yourself noticed if you then want to go into, a bigger media organization. And, from working on Think Progress, I've been able to, write more stories, pitch things out, get things published in print as well as the web, get on TV and radio a little. So that was, I sort of fell into journalism because I wanted to be around politics and cover politics, but not, I wasn't sure if I wanted to necessarily work in politics.
Thanks, you all. And I think this is an interesting study. What we've heard so far, somebody was raised to read. So literacy was the underpinning of how they got into writing. They tapped their skills. They all knew they had a skill to communicate, in the form of writing in this case. So that skill became their interest. That's what they went after. One wrote for a college newspaper, but all of them freelanced anywhere they could and everywhere they could. They all hustled. Basically, this is about hustling. Finding a way where there may not be a way, and basically getting anywhere you can, working anywhere you can, because the actual craft and art of it is what you want to do. And then another thing we heard, they didn't say, but essentially in some ways patience. Understanding that you have to just start out. Start writing, get published, and that becomes the building block for the next opportunity, as opposed to looking at a Chris Hayes on television on Sunday morning and saying, he's good, I could do that. You know what, after college, I could probably do that right now. No, you can't. No, it's true. People need to understand, students need to understand, you can't. Not because you're not good enough, but because people aren't going to take a chance on you just yet. You need to prove yourself. And even if you are good enough right now, unless you can grow your own media company and put yourself on blast everywhere, it's not going to happen. So, somebody told me a long time ago, as a journalist starting out, he said, I think you want to, there are things to learn here. When you make a mistake, you rather make your mistake around 10,000 readers instead of 1 million readers. And I thought about that. I thought that was interesting. If you make your mistake around 1 million readers and you're brand new, you often don't get a second chance because your credibility is gone. And at that level, they expect you. There's an expectation by the public for you to get it right every time. If you're at a place where there's 10,000 readers around or 10,000 viewers, your employers understand usually that they're there to help teach you. And so you can make your mistakes, because there will be many. We continue to make them. You can make your mistakes and learn from them without paying the terminal penalty of being fired or being disgraced or losing credibility. So understand that there is value in not going on the Sunday morning talk show right out of college. My experience was actually probably the most traditional out of all of us. I was in college and I got into journalism there at the University of Maryland. I had always known I'd wanted to write, so that's another thing. I'll check off this list. I knew I wanted to write in some way or another. I was an English major and I said I'll go and do some student newspaper work because it'll keep my writing skills sharp. And it got to a point where I got to run the black newspaper at Maryland's campus, and basically the daily campus newspaper wrote something that some students were upset about, so the protest was to go and steal the paper. They stole stacks and stacks of it off the news racks on college, and they said they left a sign in place of the news racks, and we're talking about a 25,000 circulation campus newspaper in the shadow of DC, so everyone kind of pays attention. Sensitivity and coverage, things I really knew nothing about. And so out of that, there was this big, there's this big convention like this, me and all the other editors of student newspapers on campus, talking about the issues, and it was just this massive, massive bitch fest about race, about coverage, about media, and that's when the journalism bug bit me. I said, okay, this is fat. I'm gonna do this for the rest of my life. So then I got student internships in college and went on to different newspapers. And so my experience is fairly traditional in the newspaper experience. But what's interesting is, with the newspaper industry dying, now I and others like me may have to take a page out of their books, because the thrust now has shifted away from newspapers. So I, not necessarily me individually, but people like me will start to having will start to retool themselves. So I say all that to say that now for you all, think about what your skills are and think about whether or not you all are prepared to work across the different platforms and media, web, TV, radio, print. Figure out if you have those skills and start asking yourself what you can do to get them. I think that the one thing I wanted to add here is that one thing I'm hearing about all of them is two things. On one hand, it's a recognition of what their skill set is. Secondly, it's a passion. You gotta have a passion for this. Money can't be your passion. If money's your passion, like Ta-Nehisi said, you're in the wrong business. However, money can come, but money comes after you demonstrate years of service and have a specialty that's marketable. At this point, we're going to do one last question, and we're going to open it up to questions briefly after this. I want each of you all to tell me or tell them what you think the story coverage opportunities are for students, how to write about this new presidency.
Well, as was mentioned earlier, I think the primary advantage you guys have is being young. One thing that's always clear to me is, and I think this is going to be, I'm going to regret saying this one day, most people who are thinkers and who are writers and who are journalists are hostages to their time. So one of the weird things about watching the Obama campaign and the lines of discussion, it did not match the African American community as I knew it. You know, it was like very much alien to me. I didn't know what they were talking about half the time. It did not, the community they were describing was not the community that I had grown up and had lived in all my life. But people are captive to their particular situations, okay? And so people come up in a certain age, in a certain time, where lines are drawn in a different way, and they reflect that. The lines that you guys see are going to be different than the ones that people up here are capable of seeing. In other words, we're going to miss stuff. I can't tell you what that is because I'm missing it, but you guys have to look for that. You know what I mean? You'll pick up the paper and you'll see and you'll be like, wait, no, no, no. There's some big thing that Ta-Nehisi, that Chris, that Amanda missed. You know, there'll be something like that. And I think you guys, I think that's the place. I think that's the place. And I think that's your big advantage. And if you're just tenacious about that, you'll see it.
Yeah, I think I really just want to re-emphasize what Corey said, which is that, you know, politics happens in its ideal form. It happens through citizens doing things, and that's more the case now in a lot of ways than it ever has been. And you have access to anyone, you have access to hundreds of political actors that no one has heard about. And the thing, particularly as a young journalist, the thing that you can bring to an editor, it's not your name, it's not even often your writing ability or your voice, it's that basically you're selling them a piece of information that they don't have access to, right? You're bringing them a story. And so you have access to people that are political actors that those editors don't know about, and that's I think, the place to focus.
Also, another thing is, as newspapers, especially a lot of local newspapers, are cutting their budgets, I think that's a great chance for college newspapers and college publications to jump in. You basically are going to become local publications, and you know, sitting in a think tank in Washington, D.C., I can't go on the ground and figure out what people are thinking in you know, towns around Georgia. So I rely on the coverage of local papers, and I think more and more media will be paying attention to what you guys are writing.
Thanks, panel. Something Chris said, I'll leave this. We'll take questions now, but write what you know. My first internship in college, all I knew was writing about sports, okay, covering games. My first internship in college was at the Wall Street Journal in the Washington Bureau. I knew nothing about business, finance, I knew nothing about national politics. I was scared as hell. One of my mentors said, write what you know. You're a young black man, what? You like hip hop, you like this, you like that, write that. And it actually calmed me a lot. And I tried to do, to some degree I was successful, what Chris said, sell my editors on things that only I knew about. People who write books, we get impressed with what they write. We're like, wow, that was incredible. Well, you know what? The truth is, we all have something incredible that we know or we have access to. Once you write about it, that's what makes it fat. It's the fact that it's yours and nobody could write it the way you did because nobody else is you. It doesn't mean that there's not something else to write, but sometimes we have to look inside ourselves and look at the community that we're around to come up with what to write about or report, instead of separating ourselves from what we know and going out and finding the news or finding stories. So don't get too far afield from what's right in front of you every day. So with that, we're going to take some questions.
We have about 5 minutes, so we'll probably only get about 2 questions in. So if you want to ask, better run.
Make them good.
Yeah. Want to come up?
So to restate, your question is, how do writers or how do journalists keep the public engaged after the election in issues?
Yeah, this is something people ask about whenever I talk to young journalists, and particularly if you care about things. There's certain kind of journalists who come into journalism without these sort of passions for a certain kind of more just, humane ordering of society. And then there are people who come, I think, from the crop that are here, which is that you come to things with a set of committed substantive principles about how you want the world to be, and journalism's outlet for that. And I think the most important thing to think about is that no one owes you reading your story. You have to earn every paragraph of people's attention. And this was the hardest thing for me to learn as a young journalist, because I would go to my editor at the Chicago Reader and I would say, I want to do a story about about this homeless shelter, because this homeless shelter is important, and they would say, yeah, sure, it's important, right? But what's the story? And at first I thought that was somehow shallow of my editor, and that I was like, you know, I was serious and like a better person because I cared, and why didn't other people care? But the fact of the matter is, it's what you do is it's your job to make people care. And there's no single way that you make people care. There's a million ways to tell stories, but that exactly is the trick, which is that people will care if you figure out a way to tell a story that's compelling. People like stories. And so if you figure out a way to tell a compelling story, you can make them care about almost anything. It doesn't matter how arcane or dry or technical the matter is. If you find a way to tell a story, you can make them care. And in a lot of ways, that's sort of what I see my job as being, is exactly that, is try to cross that gap. But what you cannot do is enter a story thinking that people are that the story is owed attention because it's important.
Thanks, Chris. Next question. Let's go further in the back. Gentlemen.
Yeah, okay. So you said that America has been moving from a center-right country to more of a center-left country. And I guess, Ms. Terkel, you were talking about how on the Campus Progress, or on the CAP blogs, y'all spend a lot of time kind of calling out right-wing commentators for the things they say. But isn't that tactic kind of also becoming somewhat out of date? It's kind of an old fight where there's these irrelevant voices are kind of being elevated.
That's something we've thought about a lot. Should we basically stop what we've been doing? And we've decided the answer is no. We're not going to do that quite as much as we did, but I don't think we can give that up. I mean, conservatives thought, okay, great, we're in power. And, you know, what did progressives do? We built up our entire infrastructure on the internet. And, you know, we had organizations like Campus Progress that started to, you know, strengthen their presence on campus and, you know, rebut what like David Horowitz was doing. guarantee conservatives are going to continue to do that. And we can't just ignore what they're doing, because progressives aren't going to be running the country forever. And we are going to have conservatives are going to be building up their infrastructure. They're trying to think of new ideas. And if we want to make sure that we get these progressive ideas through, we have to know what they're doing. We have to follow their game plan. We have to watch what they're doing. And we have to be able to, we have to know how to react, but before they do. So we have, that's the way to be on the offense, is to try to guess what they're going to do. So I think it's important to still pay attention to them. We try not to give, every time Ann Coulter says something awful, we don't highlight it. I think, that gets a little bit ridiculous. But if we think it's constructive to highlight what they're doing and rebut it and show, why this is really bad, I think we're going to continue doing that.
All right, I guess we have
one more. We have time for one more question.
One more right here.
With you talking about budgets and newspapers cutting their budgets, that's very apparent. I mean, the AJC cut 25% of its staff 2 months ago. As a young person, with this kind of new voice that's being recognized on a national and even international level, do you think there's opportunities with this kind of poor economy and with the larger news organizations having smaller budgets this fiscal year for younger people to capitalize on? Do you think there's opportunities there for us to?
And I'm going to restate the question so they can, so the rest of the group can hear it. Picking up on what I talked about with newspapers dying and budget cuts leading to fewer jobs and fewer reporters, fewer opportunities for students to break into newspapers. You're asking, with this new energy and new engagement among young people, politically, civically, et cetera, does that maybe translate to new opportunities for journalists, for student journalists? Do you specifically mean in newspapers or elsewhere?
In the media at large.
In the media at large, yeah.
And I mean, I guess with our technological skills as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to have someone else answer that first. I think yes. I mean, what we've been saying is put your stuff out there anywhere. And Ta-Nehisi talked about us being a product of our times in many respects, either products or a prisoner to or whatever. But the key is you all are at a time now where the youth culture, as it were, is starting to mature and starting to take more of a hold in what is news and how news is interpreted. So blogs, the web, that is, social networking sites, that's really social media. Those are the first and foremost opportunities for young journalists. The problem is people haven't figured out how to make money off of them to make them into an industry that can sustain itself while newspapers are dying, for example. So in my estimation, and I'm sure other people are going to chime in, Chris, in my estimation, that'll be the opportunity for you to get visibility and get experience and get published, even though it's electronically. That may not be your opportunity to make money just yet, but you use that as a body of work, as leverage to get a real job in journalism, for example.
The answer is yes. But I want to warn people away from this idea that we often have that journalism is in this cataclysmic state. Yes. I think there've always been problems, and there always will be problems. I'm a contributing editor at The Atlantic. I don't think it's unfair to say that 40 years ago that would not have been possible. 40 years ago, there was no internet. And so if you wanted to say something, you had to prove to 2, 3, 4 other people that it was worth saying. Now, there's a good side to that. There's also a very bad side to that. So I think each generation faces new challenges. This is the challenge of this generation, it really is, to find a way to tell stories and to find a way to pay for telling stories that you care about. That's the challenge, but there's always a challenge. There was never a point where there was no challenge. And so while this is a particularly alarming one for those of us who have to cope with it, I don't think we should get into a sort of woe is me-ism. I'm not accusing you of that, but I think we have to watch for that. And I don't want to communicate that to you guys at all. It was always hard. I don't know if it's harder now. It may or may not be. That's irrelevant. it was always hard, and it always will be hard, and it really should be hard.
Yeah, I would say the last thing is that it's much better to be you right now, to be 22 or 19 or 23, watching all this shake out, entering at a moment of tremendous flux and dynamism, than to be 45 with 2 kids in college and a mortgage and just getting the pink slip from the paper you've worked at for 20 years. There's a lot of people who are in that seat, and they don't necessarily know what's up next. I know people like that. And it's much better to be in your shoes right now than to be in theirs. Even if they have the status and even if people know who they are and their name has been out there, they don't necessarily know what's coming next, and you guys are in the position to kind of ride the wave as this new kind of media landscape gets sorted out. So you're in good shape.
I'll close by saying this. It used to be that the news was found in big institutions, government, corporations, et cetera, and that the vehicle for news or the vehicle for writing or expressing it or observing it was in big, mature companies, publications, et cetera. For the first time, and maybe forever, young people have the news. You all drive popular culture. You all drive consumer habits. So as a result, you drive the marketing and everything that consumer product companies do to get you. You all drive what goes on TV because advertisers want you all. And so the TV is used to shape that. You all are now involved in politics. And so for the first time and forever, let's not even talk about sports and entertainment. For the first time and forever, you all have the news. The second thing is that you all now actually have your own venue for telling these stories. You don't have to go into traditional media to do it. Now, that doesn't mean you don't go, because it's still better training. But as Chris said, it's a unique time because you all now have those two things. You all have the news and you have the method for telling it, a method for telling it. Don't look past that. It's not by itself enough training for you, and it's not enough to make a living off separately. But understand that going forward, those two things are going to be the things that you take with you throughout. The fact that you have a method for telling it and that you have the news, because that is going to evolve into some more permanent, traditional way of being employed, if that makes sense. With that, I want to thank the panel. Ta-Nehisi, Chris, Amanda, thank you all for coming out, and obviously we have programs.